The chandelier above the grand Kennedy Center boardroom shimmered like frozen fire, casting golden reflections across the polished mahogany table. A hush fell over the room as the speakerphone crackled to life, and then, unmistakably, came his voice. "I think it's something a lot of people wanted," President Donald Trump said, his tone dripping with self-assurance. "I think it's something you're going to enjoy for a long time to come." Around the table, some of the newly appointed board members nodded eagerly. Others, those who had been powerless to stop this, exchanged wary glances, their unease palpable. The old Kennedy Center was gone. Overnight, a historic institution had been ripped from its foundation, its leadership reshuffled like a deck of cards in the hands of a man who had never even stepped foot in a Broadway theater. At the far end of the room, Eleanor Stratton, a veteran arts administrator with deep wrinkles carved by decades of devotion to the arts, sat motionless. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. She had spent 30 years building this place into what it was, an institution that showcased the world's finest artists, voices that transcended politics. And now, in mere days, it had been reduced to an extension of a man's ego. Across from her, Daniel Wu, a young, fiercely talented playwright whose works had received standing ovations on these very stages, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His presence here was a final act of resistance, though he knew it was futile. He had refused to walk away, refused to let this be easy for them. Trump's voice droned on, the words sharp but almost hypnotic. "We made the presidency hot, so this should be easy." A quiet, strangled laugh escaped Eleanor's lips before she could stop herself. Everyone turned. Daniel smirked. A second of silence. Then, a voice spoke up, flat but deliberate. "Mr. President," Eleanor said, lifting her gaze to the speakerphone, "do you even know the name of the last production staged at the Kennedy Center?" The room tensed. Even those who had thrown their lot in with Trump seemed momentarily curious. There was a pause. Then, the speakerphone crackled. "Oh, well, I've heard. Some of them were terrible, believe me. Terrible. Very woke. But we're fixing it." Daniel's smirk widened, but Eleanor wasn't amused. "You don't know, do you?" she pressed. Silence. A slight shuffling sound from the other end of the line, perhaps an aide whispering something. Trump exhaled sharply. "Look, Eleanor, we're making it great again. That's what matters. People don't want this woke garbage anymore. They want real entertainment. Exciting stuff. The kind of stuff that puts butts in seats, you know?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "So, what's your first move, then? A Vegas residency? Fireworks during Hamlet?" A few muffled chuckles from the more rebellious members of the board. Others stiffened, waiting. Trump's voice sharpened. "Listen, I get it. You're mad because you lost. But we're going to bring back real American culture. We're going to have shows that people actually want to see. That's why I'm here. To make it hot. To make it win." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. Eleanor could feel the heat rising in her chest, a mix of disbelief and something dangerously close to rage. This was a man who had seized the soul of an institution without even understanding what it was. And worse, he didn't care. The room sat in silence as the weight of that realization settled over them. Then, as if sensing the moment needed his final stamp of power, Trump added, "You'll see. In a few months, you'll all be thanking me." The call ended. The room sat frozen. Eleanor felt something deep inside her shift. No, this would not stand. She slowly pushed back her chair. "We're not letting this happen." Eleanor let the silence settle for a moment, her fingers pressing into the polished wood of the table as she studied the faces around her. Some of them were already looking away, pretending to read notes or staring at the closed laptop screens in front of them. Others, like Daniel, were waiting, the tension in the air thick with something unspoken. She had spent years in rooms like this, where power was not just measured in votes but in the willingness to speak when silence was expected. And now, in the heart of what was once a sanctuary for the arts, she could feel the slow, suffocating grip of resignation creeping in. But resignation had never suited her. She turned her gaze to Richard Grinnell, seated at the head of the table where the Kennedy Center president usually presided, his suit impeccable, his expression unreadable. He had been installed so fast that the ink on his appointment papers was probably still wet, and yet he sat there as if he had belonged all along. She knew the type. Men who climbed not through merit, but through alignment, their loyalty more valuable than their expertise. He had not spoken yet, but his presence was enough. He didn't need to. The message was already clear. Eleanor's voice was steady when she finally spoke. I want to be clear about something, because I don't think some of you have considered what just happened. The President of the United States has seized control of one of the most significant cultural institutions in the country without so much as attending a single performance, without understanding what we do, without demonstrating any respect for the people who have built this place. And we, she swept a slow glance across the table, are supposed to just accept it? That's the expectation? Grinnell exhaled through his nose, barely shifting. Eleanor, the decision has been made. We're moving forward. Moving forward to what? Daniel's voice was sharper than hers, his arms still crossed. A Vegas-style review? A history of America narrated by Kid Rock? Maybe we'll just turn the opera house into a reality show stage and call it a day. Grinnell finally sat forward, his hands folding together. What we're moving forward to, he said, his voice slow, as if speaking to children, is restoring the Kennedy Center to its rightful place as a celebration of American culture. Not this, he waved a dismissive hand, elitist nonsense that alienates real people. Eleanor barely stopped herself from scoffing. Real people, she repeated, her tone edged with something cold. You mean the ones who couldn't afford to attend a performance until we introduced subsidized programs? The ones who finally saw themselves represented on stage because we made space for stories beyond the same tired narratives? Or do you just mean the people who agree with you? Grinnell's expression barely flickered. This isn't about politics, he said, which was the exact phrase people used when they had already made it about politics. This is about giving people what they actually want. Daniel let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. What they want, or what Trump wants. Does it matter? Grinnell's gaze was sharp now. The reality is, he's chairman. He has the support. And frankly, a lot of us think this is a good thing. This place has been losing its way for a long time. Too much focus on fringe ideas, too much division. We're here to fix that. Eleanor leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and for the first time in the meeting, she allowed the weight of her experience to settle in her voice. You don't fix division by erasing voices. You don't fix art by controlling it. And you sure as hell don't fix an institution by turning it into a personal vanity project. Grinnell didn't flinch, but a few others at the table did. That was enough to confirm what she already knew. Not everyone here was comfortable with this. Some were just too afraid to say it. He exhaled, as if indulging her. Eleanor, you've had a good run here. No one is taking away what you've done, but times change. Leadership changes. You can fight it, or you can find a way to be part of it. There it was. The unspoken ultimatum. She could stay, as long as she accepted the new reality, as long as she fell in line. That was how these things worked. No official firings, no outright purges, just a quiet, steady erosion of anyone who didn't comply. She had seen it before. She knew how it ended. She looked around the table again. Some of them were waiting for her to back down, to resign, to do the expected thing and walk away quietly so the transition could continue uninterrupted. That would be the easy path, the dignified path. But then she saw Amara Patel, one of the youngest members of the board, barely 30, gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles were white. Amara, who had fought to secure funding for new artists, who had pushed for diversity not as a trend but as a responsibility. Her eyes met Eleanor's for just a second, and that was enough. Because in that moment, Eleanor saw what she had spent her entire career fighting for. Not just the performances, not just the history, but the people who still believed that the arts meant something, that this place was worth protecting. She turned back to Grinnell, voice unwavering. I'm not resigning. Silence. A flicker of something in Grinnell's eyes, the briefest flash of calculation before it was gone. Eleanor straightened in her chair. And I think you're underestimating how many people are going to fight this. You can strip away leadership, you can manipulate board votes, but you cannot control the artists. You cannot control the audience. And you sure as hell cannot control the people who believe in what this place stands for. Grinnell gave a small, unimpressed smile. We'll see. She nodded once, as if the conversation was settled, then pushed her chair back and stood. Yes, she said, voice steady. We will. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, the door closing behind her with quiet finality. She didn't need them. She needed to prepare. Because this fight had just begun. Eleanor stepped into the empty hallway, her breath steady but her mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. Every instinct told her that this was bigger than the Kennedy Center, bigger than a boardroom coup, bigger than a man who saw culture as just another arena for power. This was about control. This was about erasing the work of generations in favor of something dictated from above, something stripped of depth and meaning, repackaged as entertainment for the sake of validation. She had seen this kind of shift before in smaller ways, the slow erosion of independence in the arts, but never on this scale, never this brazenly. And she knew that if they didn't act now, there would be nothing left to fight for. She pulled out her phone and dialed, her fingers pressing against the smooth screen with a precision that came from decades of making impossible calls. The line rang twice before a voice answered, clipped but alert. Eleanor? She didn't waste time. We need a meeting. Tonight. A pause. Then, how bad? She exhaled. Worse than we thought. They're not just taking over. They're gutting it. She heard the shift in the other person's breathing, the unspoken understanding passing between them like an electric current. I'll make the calls. Good. She didn't wait for a goodbye, didn't need one. She ended the call and kept walking, her heels clicking against the marble as she moved toward the exit, every step solid, every movement a decision. She had spent her life in spaces like these, where the real battles were fought in whispered conversations and quiet alliances before the public ever saw the war. And tonight, that war would begin. By the time she arrived at the small, dimly lit cafe in Georgetown, a handful of them were already there, their faces tense, their postures rigid with the weight of what was happening. Some were artists, some were administrators, some were donors who had spent years ensuring the Kennedy Center remained a beacon of artistic integrity. At the head of the table sat Miriam Weiss, a composer whose work had graced the stage for decades, her silver hair pulled back in a way that made her look as sharp as she was. Next to her, Jorge Alvarez, a theater director who had spent his career pushing boundaries, his fingers tapping anxiously against his cup. Across from them, Daniel sat, his jaw tight, his frustration barely contained. Eleanor pulled out a chair and sat down, placing her phone face down on the table. No small talk, no pleasantries, just the reality of the moment pressing in on all of them. They've installed Grinnell, she said, her voice even. It's done, and they're moving fast. Jorge let out a quiet curse under his breath, shaking his head. Of course they are. You don't stage a coup like this unless you already have the next steps planned. Miriam folded her hands in front of her. What do they want? Eleanor met her gaze. Control, not just of the leadership, but of the programming, the funding, the messaging, everything. Trump wants to make it hot, which, in his mind, means gutting anything that doesn't fit his version of entertainment. Daniel scoffed. So what? We replaced the National Symphony Orchestra with Toby Keith? We turned the Opera House into a rally stage? Eleanor didn't blink. If we let them. The words settled over the table, heavy with meaning. Miriam nodded once. So what do we do? Jorge leaned forward, his voice low. We fight. Eleanor glanced around the table, seeing the mix of determination and hesitation in their eyes. This isn't just about resistance. This is about strategy. We can't just protest. That's exactly what they expect. We need leverage. Miriam's lips pressed together in thought. Funding. Eleanor nodded. The board controls leadership, but it doesn't control every dollar that comes in. There are still independent donors, corporate sponsors, people who care about this place more than they care about politics. If we can make it clear that this takeover will cost them money, that's leverage. Jorge exhaled. And if that doesn't work? Eleanor looked at him. Then we take it public. Daniel frowned. You really think that will work? Public outrage doesn't mean what it used to. Eleanor held his gaze. Not outrage. Exposure. They want to do this quietly, without resistance. They want to make changes before people even realize what's happening. We don't give them that luxury. We make sure every artist, every donor, every single person who cares about the arts knows exactly what's being done to this institution. Jorge nodded slowly. That means press. Miriam tapped her fingers against the table. I can make a few calls. Eleanor checked her watch. Time was against them. Every hour they waited, the new board cemented itself further. She looked around the table one last time, her voice quiet but firm. If we do this, we do it now. We push back hard. We cut off their support where we can. And we make sure they can't reshape this place without a fight. But we have to be ready for what comes next, because they won't just sit back and let this happen. Daniel's jaw tightened. They'll come for us. Eleanor nodded. They already have. The silence that followed was not uncertainty. It was understanding. Each person at that table knew the risks, knew what they were stepping into. But none of them stood up to leave. Miriam was the first to speak again, her voice steady. Then we start tonight. Jorge exhaled and picked up his phone. I know a few people who will want to hear about this. Daniel leaned back, rubbing his temples. Let's make it messy for them. Eleanor picked up her phone, already dialing. The war had begun. Eleanor sat at the worn wooden table, her phone pressed against her ear as she listened to the voice on the other end, her fingers drumming lightly against the surface, the sound barely audible over the murmur of the cafe around them. The others had scattered, each taking their part of the plan and moving quickly, knowing that time was against them, knowing that hesitation would only strengthen the hold of those who wanted to strip the Kennedy Center of everything it stood for. She had spent decades in this world, watching how power moved, how it seeped into institutions and reshaped them from the inside until what remained was unrecognizable, a hollow version of what once had meaning. But she also knew something else, something more important. Power only thrived when it went unchallenged. And tonight, they were challenging it. The voice on the phone was firm, the words measured. If you go public now, you're risking a full shutdown. They could freeze everything, cut ties with external donors, block contracts. They'll paint you as reactionary, as a bitter old guard unwilling to embrace change. Eleanor didn't hesitate. And if we wait, they'll solidify their grip, and by the time anyone notices, it'll be too late to do anything about it. This isn't just a change in leadership. This is a calculated move to control everything from funding to programming, and if we don't make noise now, we might as well hand it to them on a silver platter. A pause. Then, I can get you an op-ed, national reach. But it has to be clean, factual, nothing that can be dismissed as hysteria. You need names, details, evidence that this isn't just political infighting. Eleanor's gaze flickered to the door as Daniel walked back in, his phone still in hand, his expression set in the kind of determination that meant he had gotten something useful. I'll have what you need by morning, she said, ending the call as Daniel slid into the seat across from her. He set his phone down. I got confirmation. They're planning to announce their first major programming change by the end of the week. Nothing official yet, but from what I've heard, it's going to be a full-scale purge of anything they consider non-traditional. Eleanor folded her arms. Define non-traditional. Daniel exhaled. Anything they think won't appeal to the real America they're trying to pander to. They're gutting contemporary works, cutting collaborations with international artists, and replacing them with productions that are, and I quote, aligned with American values. Eleanor's jaw tightened, meaning sanitized, corporate, and politically convenient. Daniel nodded. And that's just the start. They're also looking at restructuring the funding model to prioritize audience-friendly productions, which basically means anything that can be commercialized and sold as easy entertainment. She leaned back slightly, her mind already working through the implications. This wasn't just about artistic integrity anymore. This was about erasing perspectives, about reshaping culture into something narrow and controlled, something dictated from above, rather than grown organically through the voices of the artists who had built the institution into what it was. If they let this happen, it wouldn't stop at the Kennedy Center. It would set a precedent. And once that precedent was set, there would be no turning back. She reached for her phone again. Miriam needs to push harder on the funding front. If they're shifting resources, we need donors who will put conditions on their contributions. No unrestricted funds unless there are guarantees in place. Daniel nodded, already texting as she continued. Jorge needs to reach out to the unions. If they start losing the artists, if people refuse to work under these conditions, they'll have a logistical nightmare on their hands. She stood, grabbing her coat. And I need to have a conversation with someone who can make this hurt. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Who? She glanced at him as she pulled open the door. Someone with a bigger stage than the one they're trying to control. The night air was cold as she stepped out onto the street, but she barely noticed. Her mind already on the next move, the next step in a battle that was only just beginning. They weren't just fighting for the Kennedy Center anymore. They were fighting for something far bigger, something that couldn't be allowed to slip away without resistance. And she wasn't about to let that happen. Eleanor walked into the lobby of the high-rise building, her coat still damp from the drizzle outside, her mind already bracing for the conversation ahead. The security guard barely glanced up as she approached, his attention focused on the monitors in front of him, but she didn't slow down. She had been here before, more times than she could count, back when meetings like these were about securing funding for an ambitious new production, not about saving an institution from being dismantled by people who didn't understand it. She reached the elevators, pressed the button, and watched as the doors slid open. By the time she stepped into the private office, she could feel the weight of the city behind the glass windows, the distant hum of traffic below, the quiet hum of a world that had no idea what was unfolding inside this room. Mark Adler, one of the Kennedy Center's largest donors, sat behind his sleek desk, his expression unreadable as he leaned back in his chair. He was the kind of man who had built his influence through careful calculation, someone who didn't waste time on sentimentality. He had supported the center for years, not out of any deep personal attachment to the arts, but because it was good business, because it positioned him as a cultural patron without requiring him to actually engage in the culture itself. That was what made him dangerous. He could be swayed, but only if it suited him. She sat down across from him, resting her hands on the arms of the chair, matching his measured stillness. You've heard what's happening. He didn't nod, didn't acknowledge it outright, but she saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. I've heard the board is undergoing some restructuring. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't let the irritation slip into her voice. It's not restructuring. It's a full-scale takeover. They're gutting programming, reshaping the center into something it was never meant to be. You've invested too much in this place to sit back and let them turn it into a propaganda machine. Adler exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the desk. And what exactly do you expect me to do about it? She didn't hesitate. Pull funding. Publicly. He let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Eleanor, that's not how this works. My contributions are structured. They don't just disappear overnight because I don't like the new direction. She leaned forward slightly. But they can be restricted. You can make sure they can't use your money to fund this shift. You can make a statement that the Kennedy Center is meant to be a place for artists, not a stage for political theater. And you can remind the other donors that they don't have to sit quietly and watch this happen. Adler studied her for a long moment, and she could see the calculation in his expression, the way he was weighing risks and benefits. He wasn't someone who made decisions based on principle. He made them based on outcomes. And right now, he was trying to determine whether backing her would be worth the fight that would follow. She gave him no time to hesitate. You're already in a position of influence. You don't need them, but they need you. Without donors like you, they're just a group of political operatives trying to control something they don't understand. The only reason they're moving so aggressively is because they assume no one will stand up to them. If you take a stand, others will follow. His fingers stilled against the desk, his gaze sharp. And if I do nothing? She didn't blink. Then in a year, this won't be the Kennedy Center anymore. It'll be a hollow brand, a tool for whatever agenda they want to push next. And every dollar you gave will have gone toward making that happen. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then Adler leaned back, exhaling through his nose. I'll make a call. She nodded once, standing. Make it fast. We don't have time. She left without another word, stepping back into the elevator, her pulse steady but her mind already moving to the next step. One move wasn't enough. They needed more, and they needed it before the board could solidify its control. As she stepped back out onto the street, her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen before answering. Daniel's voice was sharp, urgent. They just announced the first cuts. It's worse than we thought. She tightened her grip on the phone. How bad? They're not just pulling contemporary works. They're canceling contracts. Independent artists, playwrights, entire productions, gone. Effective immediately. Her pace quickened, her breath steady but sharp. Who's confirming? Jorge. He's already talking to some of the artists who just got the news. We need to move now. She reached the corner and hailed a cab, sliding into the back seat as she spoke. Get Miriam. We're making this public tonight. Daniel didn't hesitate. I'm on it. She ended the call, staring out the window as the city blurred past. There was no turning back now. The fight wasn't just about stopping them. It was about making sure everyone saw exactly what they were doing before it was too late.